Okay, welcome to this set of lectures on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. We're going to be looking primarily at the views expressed by Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, which he writes in 1781, and also the way he puts it in the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. So we're primarily going to be looking at Kant's response to Hume's problem of induction and his transcendental idealism. So Kant describes himself as being disturbed by from his dogmatic slumber by reading Hume's argument. So here's Kant thinking that reason can show us, science can show us the necessary truths about reality, the way things have to be, and Hume comes along and presents a very detailed argument that this is just nothing more than something akin to classical conditioning, and that really we don't discover necessary truths by experimentation or by reason. We rather just describe psychological truths. So this is the way that Kant expresses Hume's conclusion. So he says, experience can teach us that something is the case, but it cannot teach us that it must be the case. So Kant's in perfect agreement, as long as you're an empiricist and you think that science is the only way of knowing about the world, then we'll never be able to figure out anything necessary or figure out the way the world has to be always and everywhere. We'll rather just learn that it is this way here and now. And so he's in perfect agreement with Hume's conclusion insofar as that's what you get from empiricism. But of course Kant is disturbed by this because science does claim to discover necessary truths about nature, that it does claim to discover the way the world must be everywhere and always, so that when we know that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level with the density of 1, we know that that is true everywhere, and in China, in Australia, it's even true on the moon. If you could get water with density 1 and at sea level, the same pressure, then it would boil at 100 degrees Celsius. So this is supposed to be a universal truth about the world we live in, and yet Hume comes along and shows that there's a deep problem with thinking that way if you take empiricism seriously. So now even worse, according to Kant, is that Hume showed that human beings are essentially irrational. Reason doesn't have any real role to play on Hume's theory. You may recall that for Hume, the role of reason is just to analyze ideas and to ferret out definitional relations between these ideas so that we can know that 2 plus 2 is 4 with certainty, but all that is knowing some definitional truth about the way that our ideas are related to each other, and it doesn't tell us anything about the way the world is. So we never discover anything about the world we live in with the use of reason. It's always the emotions and this kind of conditioning that's driving us, and reason is up there making up stories, so to speak, telling itself that it's these connections are necessary and that the world works in a certain way. But that's not the job that reason has, nor is it one that it can even perform. So Kant is very disturbed by this because Kant sees human reason as the source of the value of human beings. And so if you studied some of Kant's ethics, if you look at his view about the categorical imperative and etc., you'll see that Kant thinks that it's rational autonomy, the role that reason plays, which gives human beings their dignity, their value, and so he really sees human beings as special, as occupying a special place in reality, and it's due directly to their rational capabilities that they have this special place. So if Hume is right, that we are no more than animals driven by instinct, and reason is ineffectual and plays this very limited role of merely analyzing conceptual definitions, then reason can't play the role that Kant wants it to. So he really is awoken from a dogmatic slumber where he comes to realize, hey, look, I need to give a response to this argument, because if it's right, then the project that I have and that I take to be the most important job of philosophy can't be completed. So that's what Kant, this is really personal for him in that it's directly an attack on the things he holds most valuable. And Kant actually chastises people, his contemporaries, for not taking Hume as seriously as they should. So Kant disagrees with Hume. He wants to try to show that we can have knowledge about the way reality is based on reason, but he realizes that you can't just dismiss Hume with a brush of the hand as someone who holds these crazy fanatical views that reality is unconnected for all we know, but you've got to actually provide some kind of response, some kind of argument. Okay, so the view that Kant comes up with is what he himself calls transcendental idealism, and we'll talk more about why it's called transcendental idealism as we go through this set of lectures, but for now just recognize that that's what Kant called his own view, and he agrees with Hume, as I've been saying previously, that we can't learn that the causal relation is necessary and universal from experience. So he agrees that from experience we'll never derive the necessity of the causal connection. But Kant wants to point out that Hume did not show that we can't have a priori knowledge at all. In fact, Hume wasn't concerned to show that, since he just kind of takes it for granted that a priori knowledge is useless for figuring out the way the world is. And this is understandable because Hume is an empiricist, and he's primarily making an argument from within empiricism. Namely that if empiricism is true, then these various other things follow. So Hume really didn't give, at least in the sections we looked at, he didn't really give an argument against the possibility of a priori knowledge. So Kant wants to try to rectify this, and he's going to say, look, you can take Hume's argument at face value, and what that shows is that we don't get necessity from experience, but it doesn't automatically follow that we don't get necessity from reason. Now, of course, Hume agrees to some extent that you get necessity from reason, because Hume defines a priori just as the relations of ideas, and so certain ideas are defined in such ways that you can't deny them without contradiction, and Hume is happy to call that a priori, something that's knowable independently of experience. But what Kant wants to do is to argue that there's a more heavy-duty notion of a priori knowledge, which is around, which can do some work for us. So for Kant, he's going to say, yes, there is this kind of thing that Hume is talking about, this true by definition kind of thing, and that does give you a kind of necessity. But there's also another kind of a priori knowledge, which is something which is knowable completely independently of any kind of experience whatsoever. So, and this kind of a priori knowledge is not merely definitionally true. So, of course, Hume wants to say, yeah, we can have knowledge completely independently of experience, like when I know that all bachelors are unmarried males. I don't need to have any experience with bachelors. All I need to do is analyze my concept of bachelor, look it up in the dictionary, figure out what the concept means, and then I know that, of course, it's true that they're all unmarried males. So that's, you get a kind of completely independent of experience kind of knowledge. But Kant wants to say, look, we can have more than that. So Kant wants to show that there is this more heavy-duty notion of the a priori, which is essential, and that once we understand this heavy-duty notion of the a priori, we can provide an argument which answers Hume. So that's going to be the project that we'll be working on. And there really are two parts to this project. The first is the kind of technical diagnosis and statement of the problem of induction as given by Hume, and Kant's technical answer to that. And then second, there is the overarching philosophical view of transcendental idealism, which makes this answer possible and has certain consequences for views about reality and the nature of the mind. So the first thing we're going to look at is Kant's technical answer to Hume as the development of what he calls synthetic a priori knowledge, with this real heavy-duty kind of a priori knowledge that Kant wants to introduce, and this the synthetic aspect of it, which we'll come to. So that's going to be a bit technical. And then after we're done with that, we'll turn to just generally looking at transcendental idealism and the philosophical background and theory that Kant brings with him. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, we'll begin talking just about the a priori and the way that Kant wants to talk about the a priori. It's a bit difficult for us to put ourselves in the right frame of mind, so I like to start with an analogy. Suppose that I told you that there were, in fact, 25 people located in a room on the second floor of some building. So you just take this as given. This you know is true. There are these 25 people located in a room somewhere in some building on the second floor. Now, is there anything that you could come to know about this particular room? So take a second and think about that. Well, if you think about it, you'll come to see that there's quite a bit that you could know about this room without having any experience of who these people are or where this room is or anything. You could know a surprising amount of information about it. So for instance, you could know that something about the size of the room. Well, there's got to be enough space to fit the 25 people. It can't be the size of a shoebox, for instance. Now, you don't know the exact dimensions of the room, but you know that there must be enough space for each person in that room to be located at one position, and that none of those people in the room are going to be located at exactly the same position. So even if they're sitting on each other's laps, they're not going to be located at precisely the very same place in that room. So there's got to be enough space in there to hold them all. They have to be located in certain positions. Now, I can't know who's sitting where or who's standing where, but I can know that each and every person will be located at one particular place and only one particular place. Now, I can also know something about what the room is made out of. So if it's on the second floor and it's supporting the weight of these 25 people, then I know that it's not made out of shaving cream, for instance, or pudding pops, or popsicle sticks. I don't know if it's made out of wood or concrete. I haven't told you anything about that. But we can know some general structural facts about this room, given that it's on the second floor of a building and it has something like 2,000 pounds, conservatively estimating each person to weigh something like 100 pounds. At minimum, we're going to get something like 2,000 pounds. Given that there's 25 people in this room. So we have to know that it's made out of some kind of sturdy material that can support the weight of those people. So this is, notice, you're just relying on what you know to be true and asking a question, which is, given that we know that this is in fact true, what would have to be the case in order for this fact to actually be true? And that's what Kant wants to do in his argument, is he wants to start with something that we know is true and then ask the question, what possible conditions of the world would have to actually be present in order for this thing that we know is true already to be true? So he wants to ask about the conditions of possibility. So given that we know this is true, what does that tell us about the way things have to be? The difference, of course, is that he's not talking about a room as considered as some object, but he's talking about our experience of the room. So you have to recall all the way back from the Descartes section of these lectures, when Descartes gave his argument from dreaming and the argument from hallucination or misrepresentation in general. Everybody in the modern period, for the most part, accepts that when we have our normal everyday experiences of the world, we don't come into contact directly with the physical objects that exist, but rather we have to go through some process of inference. We infer that those objects are out there and that they are the cause of the experiences that we have. So in the same way, when you watch an image on a TV screen, you infer that the cause of the image on the screen is in fact the things which are represented. So if you're watching the Today Show with Kathy Lee and Hoda Kotb, and you see their images on the screen. There's Kathy Lee sitting there. There's Hoda right next to her. Those aren't the actual people you're observing. Those are the images of the people, and you just assume or infer. If someone were to ask you, you would say, oh, well, if someone said, well, why are those images on the screen there? You would say, well, because there's a camera, there's Hoda and Kathy Lee there, and the images are being transmitted, they're being captured by the camera, being transmitted to me and reproduced on this screen. You make an inference about the cause of the images on your screen. So, too, this general line of philosophy holds that when you're looking at a tree in real life, when you're awake, looking at the tree, that's in effect being presented with an image in the mind, which represents the object, the actual material object, and that just as when you look at the TV, you don't have access to Hoda or Kathy Lee, you have only these images, so too in normal sense perception, you only have access to these kinds of images. So this is what Descartes thought, and then you make an inference that the objects really exist out there and they cause your experience. He needs to invoke God in order to make sure that inference works. And then you come along with Locke, who accepts this view as well. It says matter, material objects are something I know not what that exist out there as the cause of the kinds of representations that I have. Berkeley comes along and argues that there's no good reason to believe in this matter, and so argues for a kind of idealism. So that all we have evidence for are these mental things, and if you're an empiricist, you should reject the existence of material objects altogether. Hume comes along and says, well, this question isn't really a meaningful question since we can't answer it with the methods of empiricism, so we'll never know the answer to the question. We should just give up on it and focus on what we do know about, which are the kinds of experiences that we have. And Kant is now coming along and suggesting, well, yes, let's follow that methodology. Let's start with the thing that we know about. So we may be dreaming right now, and your normal sense experience may not actually correctly represent the world outside of you. But the one thing that you know is true is that you have this kind of sense experience. So if we were to examine the actual experiences we have, examine the kind of experience of the world that we have each and every second we're awake, we could try to reverse engineer the conditions which would make that experience possible. So you're sitting here, you're looking at a table, you know that you have this experience, and Kant wants to ask the questions, how could you possibly have that experience? What would be the case? What would have to be the case in order for your experience of a table, an ordinary experience of a table, in order for that thing to be the way that it is, what would have to be true? So in a way, this is just like what we were doing with the room. We know we have some fact which we know is true, and then we try to figure out, well, how could that thing be true? Except for that Kant is going to be talking about the very structure of his experience. So he's going to think about the experience he has of the world, and then ask the question, how could I possibly have that kind of experience? How could our experience be the way that it is? So, for example, think about your experience. Look at a table, for instance, or some ordinary physical object which happens to be around you. And don't think about the table, the object, but think about your experience of that object. Put yourself in the frame of mind of, I'm just having an experience right now. The table looks a certain way to me. Examine it very closely. What can you note about it? Kant thinks that every time we have an experience, we pay close enough attention to it, we'll come to realize that the experience is always presented as occupying a certain region of space. So look at the table and you say, well, yeah, the table is presented from my point of view as being a certain distance from me and occupying a certain table-ish area of space. So now if I were to walk around the table, I would see the very same table from these different points of view, and I can sort of imagine what the table would look like if I were to walk around and see it from the other side, if I were to hover above it and see it from the top, or if I were to crawl underneath it and see it from the bottom, or squint one eye, or look at it from a diagonal, sort of looking up, and so on and so forth. So any way that the table is going to be presented to me is going to be presented as occupying some definite location in space. And of course, the same thing holds true of time. Every experience I have is always after some other experience and located before some future experience, so that I have this constant kind of streaming thing where every experience that I have as I move my body around in the space before me comes either before or after certain other experiences. And of course, we're very good at ordering our experiences temporally. For instance, I had breakfast this morning, a bowl of cereal, and I can tell that that happened before right now. So the cereal came before my talking about Kant. And this experience is coming before the experiences I'll have later this afternoon when I take care of some other business and go run errands and etc. So that I have this constant ordering of one experience after another, and I'm pretty good at knowing when things happen in my own stream of consciousness. Now, of course, this is sort of a trivial point. Yes, every time you see something, it's located somewhere. But Kant's going to make a lot out of this point. So he asks us, look, now, try to imagine having an experience of an object without that object being located in any particular place. Can you do that? Now, of course, you might have been tempted to think, yeah, but the answer is no. So if you were thinking, look, I'm just imagining some table floating in space, a pitch darkness around it, just the table right there. But even so, you're picturing the table as being located a certain way in your visual field. So either dead on, either you're above it or below it, you're off to the side, it's all very far off in the distance, like a micro dot, and there's vastness of space around it, or it's very close up. So you're always picturing the table as being located somewhere. So if this is true, then we have our first demonstration that there really is knowledge that's a priori, that tells us about the way the world must be, and isn't merely definitionally true. So we can know, without having any experience at all, that whenever we do have experience, the objects that we experience will be located relative to me somewhere and in some temporal sequence of past and prior experiences. So this is sort of similar to when we were talking about the room, and we were asking ourselves, what do we know about the people in the room without having ever met them or seen them? Well, I can't tell you where Joe is or Bob is or Doug or Sally or whatever, but I can tell you that wherever they are, they're going to be, when I open the door, I'll see them as located somewhere in that room. And in fact, this is necessarily true of any object that I will ever see. Any object that ever is seen by me or by you will always occupy some definite region of space and will be presented to me in a certain way. This is what Kant means when he says that space and time are the conditions of all possible experience. In order for there to be any experiences at all, there has to be space in order for those experiences to be located in. So this is a precondition of experience. And that's important because it's not the kind of thing that you learn from experience. And notice, it's not as though a baby is crawling around in the world when it's first born and coming to learn, oh, objects are located in space. But rather, Kant's idea is, in order to be able to see an object at all, there has to be space for it to be located. So this is something which makes possible the very having of an experience. It's not something that you learn from experience. So, but objects being located in space is not something that's merely definitionally true of being an object. So it's not as though object, the word or concept, is defined in terms of being located in space. So this is something that you can know without any experience. In fact, it's what makes experience possible. And it's not merely definitionally true. It's necessarily and universally true. And it's something about the way the world is. Objects are located in space. That's something that we can know a priori in this real heavy-duty sense of the word, which is going beyond Hume's idea that these things are merely relations of ideas. So Kant is here suggesting there's more to the a priori than relations of ideas. There's these kinds of facts that we can know about the structure of our experience, which in effect are reverse engineering the way that our mind puts experience together for us. So we're just studying the way the mind works and looking at the things that it produces. Well, it produces these experiences. Well, how could it do that? Well, first of all, there would have to be some space that these experiences could be located in, and there has to be this unit of time by which we can order these things. And so we can infer from this that space is a necessary condition of any possible experience. And we can know with absolute certainty that whatever experiences we do have, they will all take place at some time and at some particular place. So this is Kant's first demonstration that we can really have some substantive a priori knowledge that goes beyond merely being definitionally true. So, as I just said, Kant concludes that there is what he calls pure a priori knowledge. Now, what Kant is trying to capture by calling it pure a priori is the distinction between this kind of a priori knowledge that really is completely independent of any experiences at all. No particular experience ever taught you that objects are located in space, but rather this is just something which you know must be true in order for experience to exist at all. And that's different than, for instance, your knowledge that if you undermine the foundation of a building, the building will collapse. So that's something that you don't need to go out and undermine the foundation of some building to find out if you do that it will in fact collapse. You can know that independently of experience, but that's not purely independently of experience there, because it's, in fact, you've learned based on past experience that undermining the foundation of a house will result in it falling down. So you don't need to go do it now because you've already learned that fact. And that's a kind of, you might say, well, it seems a priori because there's no, you know it independently of going and doing it. But it's not the pure kind of a priori, because there was some kind of experience in the past that's playing a justifying role in your deduction. So when Kant talks about the pure a priori, he means the kind of stuff in which no particular experience plays any kind of a justification role in the deduction. So you can know that space is required in order to have experience, with no particular experience serving as a premise in that argument. Now, that's, again, just what I was saying a moment ago. That's why he terms the notion the pure a priori. There's no particular experience that it depends on. And it's important to notice, though, that, well, you get the concept of object by seeing them, and space by having experiences and so on. So you might think, look, you know, experience is playing some role here, but Kant is making this move that the experience is required merely for you to have the concepts in play. You don't need to use any experience, though, in making your actual deduction from the nature of experience in general, experience with a capital E, generally experience. So you start with that, which you've acquired, of course, by having particular experiences, but no particular experience, no particular seeing of a table or a chair or watching some sequence of events in the world is playing any kind of role in justifying your inference from the notion of experience in general to the notion of space being necessary. And that's what he means by the pure a priori. And again, this is because these things are rather the preconditions for any possible experience at all. They're the things which must be true in order for experience to exist. Now notice that this is something which is necessary. Every experience is one that's going to be in space. It's impossible to even conceive of an experience which isn't located somewhere in your frame of view. It's not possible to have an experience without space. And it's also something that's universally true. It's true of all experiences everywhere. So it doesn't matter where you have these experiences. If you go to the moon and orbit around it, the moon will still appear to be located somewhere in your visual frame of reference. If you go to Pluto, et cetera, and et cetera. So you get the picture. So Kant takes necessity and universality as the mark of the a priori. Now, so we've got to muddy the waters here in order to get Kant's full story out on the table, because we have one distinction on the table already: the a priori and the a posteriori, and we need to introduce a new distinction that Kant introduces, what he calls the synthetic and analytic distinction. So an analytic truth for Kant is one that's just true in virtue of the meaning of the words themselves. So this is the relations of ideas idea. You're just given a new spin. So for Kant, the analytic relationship is one of conceptual containment, so that he really thinks of the concept. So now we're talking about this mental thing, the concept of a bachelor contains within itself the concepts of unmarried and male put in a certain relationship, so that the idea is, we can just say as modern people, well, it's meaning entailments here. These are definitional things, but Kant really thinks of it as a containment relationship. And so to be technically correct, you would say the concept bachelor contains these other concepts, because this is the way that Kant talks about it. But it's just another way of capturing what Hume meant by the relations of ideas. These things, just like Hume said, they don't add anything new to our knowledge. You don't learn anything new about bachelors by being told that they're unmarried males. If anything, you learn what a bachelor is, but you don't learn anything about bachelors. So this is the idea of containment. When you examine the concept, you just see that it already has within it the concepts of unmarried and the concepts of male. Synthetic truths, on the other hand, are ones where there isn't this kind of conceptual containment relationship. So when you think about the sentence, all bachelors are messy, you look, quote unquote, inside the concept of bachelor, and you see it contains unmarried and male, but it doesn't contain anything in there about messy. So you could fully master the concept of bachelor. You could know everything there is to know about what a bachelor is, and still not know whether it's true that all bachelors are messy, because there's nothing contained in the concept which would tell you that. Now, when someone tells you that bachelors are in fact messy, what they're telling you to do is to synthesize a new fact. And that's why Kant calls these synthetic truths. So, and when you take a synthesis, you take two things which were not joined before, and you join them. So you have your concept of bachelor, and it contains these things just by definition, just by being the kind of concept that it is. And when someone tells you that bachelors are messy, they're telling you to take your concept of a messy person and to put it inside the concept of a bachelor, so that now it's in there, but not as part of the definition, but as something which is new. So you would star it, for instance. This is something new about bachelors which you didn't know before. So you're making a new fact. Join the concept of messiness to the concept of bachelors. So analytic truths are ones which you just analyze the concept and see whether it contains these various other concepts as part of its definition, and it doesn't tell you anything new. And synthetic concepts are, by their definition, they're adding to what we know about these things. So you don't know, but by just having the concept, you don't know a priori whether bachelors are messy. You need to go and check some bachelors, and then if you find that all bachelors are messy, you can join the concept of messiness to bachelorhood. And if you find that they're not, then you would disjoin them. You would say they don't belong together. So this is the way that Hume thought about all of the a priori and a posteriori stuff. He says, look, this is it. You have those things which are true by definition and don't add to our knowledge, and you have those things which are not true by definition and do add to our knowledge. And that's all that you get. And now what Kant has done is to make a four-way distinction with using two sets of distinctions. So to put all this together, Hume claimed that something was a priori when, if you denied it, you get a contradiction. So Hume says, look, All we mean by the a priori is that if you deny it, you get a contradiction. And of course, when you have definitional relationships, that turns out to be true. If you deny it, you get a contradiction. So using this, he divides everything into relations of ideas, which are necessary, and matters of fact, which are contingent. And Kant has just relabeled this division the analytic-synthetic division. So Kant says, look, okay, so you have those two categories, but you also have these other two categories. You have the a priori, which is also analytic. So remember, a priori for Kant is meaning something more substantial, more heavy duty. So a priori truths are ones that are necessary and universal. They tell us how the world actually works. And you could also join that with a truth that's analytic. So all bachelors are unmarried males is in fact something which is true by definition and also necessary and universal. So those two things go together for Kant, being analytic and being a priori. And it's true that all analytic truths are a priori for Kant because it's true that these definitional relationships hold of necessity and have universal characteristics. So all bachelors are unmarried males. It's impossible for there to be a bachelor that's not a married male. Okay. But on the other hand, there's, you could see a category of being analytic and a posteriori, truths which are true by definition, and really don't tell us anything new about the subject, but also ones that are discovered by experience. And Kant says, look, there's none of those. This is something which has become interesting in later years, and in fact, there are some. For instance, one of my professors in graduate school, Saul Kripke, is famous for suggesting that scientifically discovered definitions like water equals H2O, where we're talking about the essence of an object, that counts as a kind of definition, and also something which is a posteriori, discovered by experience. And so some people have said, well, what Kripke is talking about shows that there are analytic a posteriori truths. But that's a different question for a different day. We talk briefly about Kripke's views in the final lecture of the class when we look at some contemporary philosophy of mind. But we'll put that off till later. Kant says, no way. That doesn't make sense. Okay, but there is synthetic a posteriori, which is the kind of judgments that add to our experience, like that pizza is delicious, dogs bark, and the taxes are a certain rate, etc. And also stuff which is neither necessary nor universal. So the synthetic a posteriori adds to our knowledge and is learned from experience. But there's one category here which has been overlooked so far, Kant thinks, and that's the synthetic a priori. So synthetic means that it adds to our knowledge about the world. But the a priori bit tells us that this is something which is necessary and universal and is a truth about the way the world works. Now Hume, of course, denied that there were any synthetic a priori. He says everything is either synthetic a posteriori or analytic a priori. There's only two categories. And Kant's answer here is to say, no, if you think about these things in a different way, then you can see that there's a third category, the synthetic a priori. And what's interesting there is that you have a combination of the rationalist view, that knowledge is gained by experience, because you have the a priori doing some real work, but you combine that with the empiricist idea that you have to learn certain things from experience. And so Kant thinks that you get a kind of symbiosis between the two major schools in epistemology that have been battling. And one of his great achievements in Kant's own mind was that he was able to provide a kind of philosophy that really used the best of both of these two kinds of methods. So Hume's mistake was that he didn't recognize that there was a kind of real a priori knowledge which could add to our knowledge about the way the world works, that we could actually do metaphysics in the sense that we could figure out how the world really is using reason. And then that would tell us something new about the way the world is. So let's pictorially represent this, and this is just going to be the same stuff we were just talking about, but using a graph so that we can see what's going on here. So on the top up there, we have the a priori and the a posteriori. And running down along the sides here, we have the analytic-synthetic distinction. So it gives us four categories. So One category is the a priori analytic. Those are things which are true by definition. They do not add to your knowledge. They are necessary. They can't be false. And they are universal. They're true everywhere and at all times. So there we have like things like all triangles have three sides, true by definition, and etc. So on the other corner, the diagonal there, we have our synthetic a posteriori truths. These things do add to our knowledge. They're not merely definitionally true. Learning that dogs bark is learning a new fact about dogs. And in fact, I famously, when I was a kid, I didn't know what sounds certain animals made. So for instance, what sound does a giraffe make? I didn't know, and I sort of just thought that they were named after the sounds that they made. So a giraffe would go giraffe or something like that, in some animal-y kind of way. And of course, that turns out to be wrong. But the way I discovered that it was wrong was not by learning what a giraffe was. I already knew that, but it was learning, actually going to a zoo and observing giraffes and reading about them and having experience with these animals. So those things tell us something new. They add to our experience. They are neither necessary nor universal. Not every dog barks. There are some dogs that don't bark. Those are called good dogs. Just kidding. Not every apple is delicious. Some apples are bad, and etc. So you have those two categories, which are just Hume's categories. So Hume would have called the top left one the relations of ideas, and he would have called the bottom right one the matters of fact. And Kant has just reworked this into his own framework, calling one the analytic a priori and the other one the synthetic a posteriori. Now, the analytic a posteriori section, I've already told you, Kant in particular argued that there was no such distinct, the category was empty, that there's nothing in there. Other people have wondered whether that's true, but we're going to leave that aside for now. The big question is there anything in the synthetic a priori category? Now notice there's one thing which is missing from our list. If you think about all the stuff we've been talking about that Hume was interested in, there's one set of facts which we know to be true, which is not represented up here, and that is math in the form of arithmetic, but mathematics in general. So notice, not geometry. Geometry we know is already belongs in the analytic a priori category. But what are we to say about mathematics? Well, Hume would have put it in the analytic a priori category. For instance, knowing that 7 plus 5 equals 12, according to Hume, doesn't tell you anything new about the numbers 7 and 5 to find out that their sum is 12. What that tells you is just part of the definition of what it is to be 12, what it is to be plus, what it means to be equals. All these things are just interdefined in such a way that it just comes out as definitionally true of the sentence 7 plus 5 equals. There's no other way. That's like saying all bachelors are. There's only one way to complete that, unmarried males. So too, 12 here would just follow from the definitions of the terms employed. So Kant doesn't think that that's true. He asks us to consider very large numbers. Like, for instance, what is the sum of 141316998 and 759586773? Well, if you're like me, you don't know what the sum is. You know that there's some number, which is the sum of those two numbers. But what it is, I don't know. But surely I understand what each number on the left-hand side is. I know what 1,116,000 or whatever I said is, whatever particular number it is. I know what that is. But yet I don't, and I know what plus and equals mean. But all that I can get from analyzing those concepts is that there is some number or other. There exists a number, which is the correct answer. And so Kant actually thinks that mathematics is an example of the synthetic a priori. 7 plus 5, if we just think of that, 7 plus 5, well, We all know that it's 12. But we know that because we've added this a bunch of times, memorized it. But in the old days, you might used to have to count on your hand. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You actually do the arithmetic, and then you find out the answer. Ah, the answer is 12. And now you know, forever and for always, that 7 plus 5 equals 12. So it is something which is necessary and universal. But notice that it wasn't something that we got analytically. We didn't get it for just by analyzing the concepts of 7 plus and 5. We could have fully mastered what 7 is. Of course I know what 7 is. It's the prime number that comes after 6 and before 8. And of course I know what 5 is. It's the prime number which comes after 4 and before 6. And I know what plus is. It means that you add those two together. I know what addition is. I know what equals means. Any two objects that are identical, have all the same characteristics, etc., etc. But yet, even fully mastering those concepts, before I did any addition whatsoever, I couldn't know what the answer was. So I learned something new about the subject here, 7 plus 5. Consider that a subject term as a sentence. I learned something new about that by doing the addition. But yet at the same time, I know that whatever answer I get has to be that answer every time. So I can know a priori that whatever answer in fact I arrive at is a necessary and universally true answer that always will be 12 when I add 7 and 5. And I don't need to sit around and do it a bunch of times to make sure of that. So it does add to my experience. It does add to my knowledge. It tells me something new, so it's a synthetic judgment, but at the same time it's an a priori judgment. The justification of mathematics is not something based on experience. Even though in this particular case, doing the math actually taught me something new about these numbers, namely that when they're added, they're equal to 12. So now, of course, you should probably see where this is going. All of the concepts which Hume thought were problematic, Kant is going to argue those ones fall in the synthetic a priori. So cause and effect, we can't know that it's necessary. Well, the fact that it's necessary is something we can know that's synthetic and a priori. The existence of the self as a permanent, unchanging thing, synthetic a priori. The existence of an unobserved world that continues to exist when we're not looking at it, synthetic a priori. So everything that Hume thought we couldn't know, Kant's going to argue we can in fact come to know those things, but it is only because we are developing this category of synthetic a priori truths. So just to sum that up, Kant's answer to Hume is his theory of synthetic a priori knowledge. So let's just take an example to put all of this together. Take, for instance, the sentence fire causes pain. Hume says you can't know that that's necessary. It may have caused pain in you many times in the past. Every time you put your hand in the fire in the past, you've had a certain experience of pain. But of course, that doesn't mean that tomorrow when you put your hand in the fire that will cause pain. For all you know, that it will just cease to be that way because there's nothing necessary about it. It may just be accidentally for all this time, that's the way that it's been. So this is certainly synthetic, right? You can analyze the concept of fire and you'll never get the concept of producing pain in us. You only get that when you've actually put your hand on something hot or into a fire. So you learn something new about fire when you feel what it's like to be burned. But at the same time, we can know a priori that whatever experience fire produces in us is the one that it must always produce. So that if you put your hand into the fire, even before you do that, you can tell, whatever's going to happen is the necessary consequence of this event. And you don't learn that from putting your hand into the fire. You learn that in the same way you learn that space was necessary by thinking about the conditions that make your experience possible. So if there was no necessary connection between these events, the kind of experience that we have would be radically very different. It wouldn't be this nice, orderly, regular, law-governed kind of experience we have. In fact, it should expect it to be just random, not connected, more like dream experience. So what's a priori is that you can tell by the structure of our experience that whatever happens is going to happen again the same way the next time you do the thing in the same way. So if you put your hand and you don't wear this thing and the temperature is X and the pain is a certain level and you recreate that exactly, then you're going to get exactly the same result. That's the thing that you know by examining your experience. You can tell by the way the experiences are structured. When you have dream experiences, that you put your hand in one time, it tickles, you fly to the next place, your grandma's there but doesn't look like your grandma. Everything's random, disconnected, nothing makes sense. But in our normal waking lives, we have this reliable, predictable, structured world that we interact with. And the only way that that could be possible, Kant argues, is if there were some necessary connection between these events, the cause and the effect. Now, of course, you don't know what effect is going to follow from what cause a priori. That's why you learn something new when you stick your hand in the fire. Yeah, that's what fire causes. But you know that once you've figured out what the effect is, that thing is something which is necessary and universal. So, all we've been doing, though, is talking about the structure of our experience. And that leads us to the discussion of the phenomena and noumena distinction and Kant's general view of transcendental idealism, which we'll start in the next lecture.